So let's start with what's been like your experience of working at Indiana Oxygen. Were you always wanting to get into this field? How did that look for you?
Yeah, it's funny that question comes up a lot, and it's interesting in comparing that to my sister's answer because I think she would say she had no intention of joining the business. I, on the other hand, I can't really remember a time that I didn't plan on coming into the business. We worked here in different parts of the business, whether it was painting cylinders or washing customers' cars as they'd come into the store. We did all kinds of stuff growing up. And I think without maybe fully grasping it, I saw my dad every day. He was, for the most part, able to come to all of my sporting events and activities as a kid. He enjoyed going to work, and you could just tell he was passionate about it. And I think I just realized that that was probably unique. And again, from a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, understanding that being part of the family business at that age was a tremendous opportunity. And just seeing the pride and the passion my dad had for it. I grew up planning on coming into the business. Graduated from college, had no idea really what I was doing, which is typical. Got a chance to do like a 9-month internship with Lincoln Electric, which was a unique opportunity, but spent time in their welding school and spent time with their sales trainees. Really gave me the opportunity to learn the industry and just learn welding, right? The core process of our business. So did that. Also through a GATA member, got the chance to work on the West Coast as a new salesperson. Learned plenty of lessons, both good and bad, and had many humbling experiences, but did that for about 3 years and then moved back to Indianapolis that would have been 2010. Went into a sales position with Indiana Oxygen, was in that role for a number of years, and then we decided we were going to go through an ERP changeover. And at the time, I think I was one of the younger people in the company. I was certainly the one kind of raising the red flag saying that we needed to do this. And more or less, they said, okay, you take it, you run with this. And we recognized the need to create the CIO position within the company. We didn't have one at the time. Again, this was a new level of embracing technology. So I knew that by training, I was not qualified, but I had the energy to do it. And more or less, I was going to be a placeholder, a project leader and a placeholder for that position to be taken on by someone at some point better qualified than me. So I served in that role for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And then the time came when we had an opening in our chief operating officer position within the company. And that really sat vacant for about a year. We didn't know what direction we were going. At the same time, we had another young-ish individual in our company that just showed the ability to take on a lot of responsibility and get things done. A high achiever. And it was a natural fit to say, this guy is better at my job than I am. He is qualified for this. He can take that to the next level. So I jumped at the opportunity when it was presented to me of jumping into the operations role. And it was really good for me in my development because it got me back into the core part of our business. Working through an ERP changeover was fantastic for my development because in building a system like that, you touch every single process from start to finish throughout every department of the company. That was a very unique opportunity, but it was also probably the most valuable thing I've done as far as learning the business. And then after a while, there was a need to break out of the computer space, so to speak, and get back into what I would consider the core piece of how a gas and welding distributor operates. So I've been in that role for, I believe, the last 4 years. I'm still there today. And it's been a fun transformation for myself and also the people, the management team that we've built in filling some of these other roles. And that management team is a kind of a living reflection of what's important to us as a business. It didn't look like that 10 years ago. We have I guess we have 3 different positions on that leadership team that didn't exist before then. So
Wow.
just trying to evolve the people within that team are evolving as the company changed.
That's great. Now I have a million more questions. It sounds like you are really good at long-term thinking, which is a very difficult thing for especially a 12 or 13-year-old to do and just know what they want. I know Wally had talked about like the playbook or like the rules that he made, or I guess like structure for yourself and your sister to follow if you want to get into the family business. Do you think that helped play a part in like how you conduct yourself in business today, or like how you wanted to get into the family company?
Yeah, so the playbook I think you're referencing, the executive policy manual, which
Yes.
basically guides any big decisions that my sister and I would need to make, entering, exiting the company and all that stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't answer every question, but it does lay a framework to hopefully avoid some catastrophic events. It mainly just coming to mind, if one sibling wants to leave the business, you got to have rules in place so that it's possible. No one's a prisoner here, but you got to do it in a way that the company can survive that transition. So yeah, from that perspective, it was a nice framework to have. There are also things in there regarding like sweat equity. It was important to my dad, and it always has been, that if you're going to be in the business, that you contribute. My sister and I think, are fortunate that we have different skill sets, and in both our involvements and existence in the company, we've never had to really compete, which, we can't take credit for. I think we're lucky in that scenario.
Yeah.
We both have strengths, we both have different interests, and have found a different fit in the business while still being able to work together. So the framework is great, but I think that piece of our partnership is really what has made this not easy, but certainly much easier than it could be.
I think that's great. I'm telling everyone I talk to for the succession panel discussion things that I normally wouldn't say, but my dad was very much like, we don't expect you to work at this company at all. Go do your thing, make something of yourself that you want to make of it. So we always worked here. Like I had 3 jobs in high school and this was one of them, but I was like, oh, I'm never going to work here. But I didn't really understand how I would play a role in Ratterman with what my skill sets are. And now like, then you go and you work other places, you come back and you realize, oh yeah, you can be creative and work in the gas and welding industry. It's like funny how it is through like the conversation with your father and with your sister and with yourself. I think if there was a little bit more structure around what would be expected of me, how I could play a role, those type of things, it's almost like going to college and them saying, hey, if you want this degree, this is like what we expect of you. So I feel like that could be a little more helpful, just from my perspective.
It's hard. Like if you think from your dad's perspective, your parents, thinking of how I would write a framework for my kids and you want to tell them you need to contribute. And if you don't, here's what's available to you. Ultimately, at some point, you or your siblings or anybody else, even on the executive team, you have to have honest conversations about what you want and how you see yourself fitting in, and what your goals are within the company. And I think it was harder for those things to develop for me, and culminated in a conversation with my sister at one point, just being like, what do you want out of the company? Like, for some reason, even as adults, it's a nerve-wracking conversation. Are you planning on cutting a check and leaving in 2 weeks? Are you in this for the long haul? Do you want to have this around for your kids? And having really honest conversations about that is super important. And the framework that he gave us, it's not forcing us to have those conversations. It is certainly a guideline, but it didn't answer everything.
Yeah, no, okay. That's one of my questions. Is there something you would add or change to that, or to succession planning in general?
I think, and I certainly don't want this to come off as a critiquing all of Wally's work.
No.
I'm scared to death for the day that my daughter or son decide to come in. That's pretty daunting, but I don't think we had enough of those conversations early on. He did a good job of, again, having some rules in place to cover the really big issues. But we haven't always been good about having those honest check-ins with one another. We certainly work together on a regular basis and know from the day-to-day what each is working on within the business. But early on, we didn't talk enough about short-term career goals that each of us might have, or certainly not the long-term goals. I don't know if that's because my dad, he is so in love with the business that he couldn't even fathom anyone having different feelings or different long-term goals. And I think in a lot of ways we all line up closely to how he feels, but we didn't have those conversations and he wasn't pushing them. So I think just having a framework in place, but also having regular goal check-ins as a family, like would be one thing that I think we could have done a better job early on specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully said. I relate to that so much because Mary was at Ratterman as well. And we never really had those discussions. I remember meeting with not a mediator, but a consultant type of guy that came in a few years ago. And it was before COVID. And I thought I was going to be in the fashion industry, like all this stuff. And he was like, so where do you see yourself in the company? I was like, oh, I don't. Like, my older sister is going to take over the company. So I'm going to be gone in like a year. And that went back to my dad. I didn't know. I should have known it was going to go back to my dad. So my dad was just like, okay, like she's just happy here and she's doing her own thing on the side. But then I actually became very passionate about my work. And I was like, wait, why am I being left out of these situations? And he's like, I had no idea. And then Mary, I tabled with her and I was like, hey, I just see you taking over this company. Is that how you see yourself? And she's like, oh, actually, I'm going to go back to law school. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's like we could have prevented not knowing that years prior. But
yeah,
it's also life, right? Like things transition in different ways and unfold in different ways. Like your sister didn't know she wanted to be a part of this company right away. But
yeah.
The
story about that, there's a piece in the executive framework that's talks about sweat equity. And at some point, if one person, there's like I forget what it is, 5 years or whatever, but there's a time frame where if you're putting in more work than the other person, you start to accumulate the opportunity to have ownership at a different rate than the other person.
Yes.
So I kind of announced, I forget how the story was, it's not important, but I called my dad and I said, we're moving home from the West Coast. I'd like to talk about coming to work. And he said, oh, that's great because your sister starts January 12th. And I'm thinking, she's just trying to get seniority here. That we started like a few days apart. And it's been great. We came back almost within the week of each other.
That's so funny. That's actually a question I was going to ask your dad on our next talk because we talked a lot about the sweat equity. I think it's a brilliant idea. But I wonder if you two were as close as you are, if it could cause a lot of tension.
Oh, for sure.
If you guys were going for similar roles or whatever, I feel like that could get a little crazy, but it's a great idea. It's a good jumping off spot.
Yeah. There's a lot of opportunity within a family business for conflict. And again, like, I think we're fortunate that we have different strengths and just can have naturally had different paths to contribution. But there were some times I think where both of us would admit that either we were in the dark or we didn't know how this was going to pan out or where we fit in. Or I think just establishing an environment of we're going to have a normal schedule for these check-ins and keep both short-term and long-term discussions open. That probably would have helped.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Okay, so do you have questions around succession planning or what were your biggest questions?
From my perspective, I was lucky that opportunities for my development within the company seemed to come along at the right time. There was no grand plan set out from the day I showed up to he's going to do this and then this. Just took the opportunities that were presented and tried my best to run with them. But my questions around the succession plan really go back to, again, just having these conversations and what are your expectations? What do you want to be doing? And from my dad's perspective, I've got to think with two capable kids in the business, that's a pretty daunting thing to take on. He's not exactly beating down our door to come say, who's going to do what in a couple of years? Who's going to take my seat? Where do you guys fit in? And so a lot of those conversations were actually initiated by me and Ann, having those with each other and trying to understand how we could both contribute in the best way for the business. And for years, and I mean this, and this is probably hard for some to believe, but we really came from the perspective of, as owners, in equal owners, we have the same interest in the success of the business. And that certainly helps through this process. As it pertains to our families and the health of the business, the healthier from a financial standpoint the company is, the better off we all are. And when that's the focal point, it really becomes a matter of getting the right people in those positions within the company, even if they don't share our last name. If it were to come down to ego or come down to the feeling that it just one of us, because of our name, has to be at the top of that ladder, if we're not the right fit, that doesn't work too well. I think an important step in our succession plan was us really coming to that realization that the company's bigger than us at this point. We have to be prepared to let the right person lead at the right time. And I don't think that's ever something my dad, maybe he just had a lot of faith in us, and we've had really good. Gary Halter is just a fantastic president and has been a wonderful resource for my sister and I as we've come up through the business. But so it's probably a little easier to feel that way. But yeah, that understanding that the company is bigger than us, it's bigger than our last name. And as equal owners, we have a mutual interest in the success of the company, or an equal interest at that.
No, I love that. Yeah, it takes away the ego because you know that you're invested financially and it's just how you fit best. I think that's amazing. The question that comes up that I'm going to ask your dad, and if you have words to share as well, please do, but is the how, right? Like, how do you get those people into the right seat? And maybe maybe it goes back to those conversations you're talking about.
I think, I'm sure there's plenty of tools. This is probably a pretty undeveloped answer. I know there's probably a lot of ways you can arrive at that. I also think that is a skill that some people have and maybe are better at than others. My dad, I think, is very good at that. He started building our executive team many years ago. And as we progressed through the company, he allowed that team to change based on the needs of the company, trusted us when we had strong feelings about certain people. But I think that's something he's just naturally good at. And Gary Halter being president, being that kind of that linchpin right in the middle of a family business was probably the most important piece there. Talk about a guy with no ego. He is a servant leader. He loves the company, he loves the people. And he's been huge in the development of the people around him. And again, that idea in a family business that, I don't know, he serves an important role and an important seat. He works in a family business. He knows the important and vital role he plays, and look at the success of that business.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think that's a good message for people as well. People as in family ran companies that are maybe afraid to bring someone in from the outside to sit in the right seat.
And I think one more thing on that, another thing I know my dad was very clear of in building that team, and especially when Gary came on board, is just being upfront about that stuff. I have 2 kids coming into the business. Part of your responsibility is nepotism is a tricky thing, but entrusting him to help us through. So I think just being upfront in the initial hiring process was probably an important piece there.
Yeah. And also he's upfront with him, and I can picture Gary saying, okay, yeah, I'll help, bring these kids along, nurture them, teach them all that I can. And whatever seat that they sit best in is where they're going to be. So it's not saying they're just handing you that job. You still have to work for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a next gen, what advice would you give to the past gen about passing the torch?
I think, and this is just what's important to me, when that happens, there's different ways to pass the torch. Here's the torch, I'm out. Here's the torch and not really letting go of it.
Yeah.
But then there's passing the torch and understanding that whether it's a change in someone's title or possibly how many days they're in the office, I don't know. It's different based on the company. But speaking from our perspective, whenever that happens, I know my dad is going to be in the office almost every day for the rest of his life. He just loves it too much. And that's fantastic. But working with us, the next generation, understanding that their role has changed from maybe the person calling the shots every day on the ground floor to fully realizing that how much value they have, this wealth of knowledge, not so much to steer the ship, but to be there as a resource. And understand that from our perspective, we very much want that and need that and are open to it. So it would hurt my feelings or make me sad to think that idea of passing the torch is someone being forgotten or less valuable to the company.
Beautiful answer.
Thank you.
Yes. And also talking with your dad, like that's such a sweet response. He needs to see that clip because I know he was expressing, I asked him like, what's your biggest fear of passing the torch? And he said, staying relevant, like not being forgotten, but a little bit along those lines, which is really sweet because he just loves the company so much.
Yeah. And what an honest and vulnerable answer. That's the truth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And how has having someone from outside the family as president helped in your succession planning? And do you have any questions or lessons you'd like to share around this structure?
Yeah, I think for us, having Gary in his position has been important because he is, again, I mentioned earlier, he's the linchpin of our executive team and this company. And in a lot of ways, I know there's the org chart, but he's also plays that important connection point between family members and non-family members. It's not the family and then the company, but when you have three people from one family focused on the future and where to take the business, and there's that constant question on the table of, are they for sale? Are they for sale? I think Gary can be a comforting force in communicating, maybe in a way that they better understand or they are more inclined to believe.
I think that's a great answer. It brings credibility to, it allows, and maybe this isn't what you're trying to express, but from what you were saying, I kind of picture like it allows employees to feel like they have a place to also see themselves within the company because they're not just seeing the family members, they're seeing someone else that's leading.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I get a little self-conscious whenever the Brant family or the Brant name is used in conjunction with the business because it's just not, it's not about us. And I think Gary's probably the best representation of that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Yes. Beautifully said. Okay. And do you have advice for the next generation? So our generation, do you have advice for the next generation around succession planning?
Yeah. So my advice to the next generation would be have the tough conversations early, have them often. And if you run into a situation where you have multiple people with their eyes on the same responsibility or seat on the bus, don't be afraid to reach outside the business, find a consultant, find someone that's gone through this process and help steer you through that. Because if you delay, if you put it off, it's only going to be a bigger issue later. And I think the earlier, you don't have to have this laid out, who's going in what positions 10 years from now, because people change and people's abilities change. That'd probably be a bad strategic move. But at some point, it is important to understand where people are going to go so that they can start developing the thinking as if they were in that particular spot or role within the company. So my advice would be have the tough conversations early and often and get help from outside the company, from a consultant if you need it. But just you owe it to the company to be honest about these types of things. It won't help you to delay that.
That was fantastic. That was really well said. Cool. And are there parts of the succession structure that have helped to empower you or helped you?
I think just growing up in the business, I have always felt a connection and a type of ownership of what Indiana Oxygen is, what our vision is, what I think it could be. And so I always felt empowered just being fortunate enough at an early age to understand that I wanted to be part of it, and I had that opportunity, was empowering enough, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. And one more question. What sets family owned ran companies apart from just corporations? Why should people work for family ran companies?
I am certainly drawn to a company that is of a certain size that allows for a low level of politicking. And again, I can only speak from our perspective, but when I think of the definition of a family run business, I think of a certain set of morals and ethics. I don't think of necessarily a small business or a large company, but I think of a company that truly cares about one another from top to bottom within the organization. Some days it's harder to live that out than others, but it's certainly something we keep at the forefront of most or all of our decisions and try and live out. So I guess with that if that is important to somebody, I would say that's a great reason to work for a family-owned business. I just can't guarantee that there aren't also public companies that don't operate the same way.
That was a great answer.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a home run. Well, thank you so much for your time and wisdom and all the above.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for including me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jay. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Good luck with the weather.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.